Okay, that is really, really great, Anthony. Just there's just so much life, so much vitality, and the fullness of the orchestration is just huge. And you probably will, having said that, you'll probably hear me trying to argue you into cutting back on it quite a bit, right? Like just if is there any way you could lighten up the texture in a lot of these lines? Really, I would say that, like, especially for the brass, they would consider this to be what they would call a big blow, if you know what I mean. So like they would feel blown out by the time they got to the end of it, because the brass is just used everywhere. It's so it's so present. It's I've been using the word relentless to describe one of the sections of this piece. So I would say, yeah, relentlessness. Like that, just really there's very, very little let up, and it's playable, but it's still, for the most part, but it's still just very, very tough on the player, if you know what I mean. So let's talk a little bit about the harp here. Okay, we've got a slight problem here. I think that this is intended to go here, right? So this would be E and then F an octave higher and so on. So I think this is kind of unnecessary. What you really need is something like this, right? Just a, and your average harpist has no problem with lots of ledger lines, right? I mean, you could, or maybe you could go like this, right? So I think that's much more readable. Okay, but the problem that you got here is not so much. Okay, and also, right? Oops. You only need one dynamic marking in the middle, so long as you have it marked like all voices, which we can see here on the keypad. So yeah, see, all voices, which you can select by using Alt or Option 5, right? You can assign different voices to it, like just holding down on the Alt or Option key, like 1, 2, 3, 4. And then when you get to 5, that's all voices. Okay. Okay, but the problem is not so much the harp, right? The scoring of the harp. The problem is that you have so much weight here in terms of, just so many other instruments playing at fortissimo at the same time as the harp. There just is no way that the harp will be heard. And also, shouldn't the dynamic go here? Right? Shouldn't it be at the start of the passage rather than at the end of the passage? So, but even at that, what would really be heard here would be like an upsweep glissando. So, if you have massive scoring like this, really, really big, beefy scoring, and especially with lots and lots of brass, then the only way that the harp could be heard is like big rolled chords, glissandos, and also like if there's like some part of the acoustic picture that isn't being taken up so much, like not a lot of high pitches, the harp could possibly be playing some kind of figuration above, right? But there isn't any space above because we have so much high scoring, right? So yeah, so like about the only way that the harp would be heard here is if there was a big like upsweep or downsweep glissando leading, into the, like maybe into the downbeat or something like that. All right. Okay, so now let's talk about something else. so here you've got a tied grace note with an accent at the beginning at the end. So how does this work? Right? Are you saying you want the player to accent at the beginning and then accent again, or do you just sort of mean, oh yeah, well, it's all accented, right? And do you mean you want the player to start the note just a fraction of a beat early, right? So if you're thinking about just thinking about the construction of this, there is here we have spread across these two lines, we have the basic construction of the right hand in that bar, right? So the little finger and the pointer of the hand are hitting this hard, and that is why there's an accent at the beginning. Then it slurs down to this B, and that is why there's an accent on the following note, right? It is because the thumb note is going to be hitting very hard all on its own, but it doesn't mean that the top note is going to be hitting another accent, right? So you have this yeran, 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 bum, 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 bum. All right, so I think that you need to rethink this. You could just completely lose that grace note, and everything would sound fine, right? Or you could trade off, like you could have this B slur down to this B, and this E slur up to that B, right? And that way you could maintain the integrity of the grace notes, but just not end up with this problem of the B sounding early in one of the instruments, because that's going to throw the whole orchestra off, right? Just why are the violinists coming in early? Asks the contrabassoon player, right? So it just has the effect of having somebody come in early, even if you didn't intend two separate accents in a row. Do you see what I'm saying? So it just really complicates things to throw that in there. All right, so those are the main problems from the beginning of the notation and stuff like that. And then there's kind of a general concern all throughout. If you are going to have two flutes, two oboes, two clarinets, and so on, two bassoons, you need to tell us when there's only a single line playing, who's the player, right? Should this be the first player, like player number one, in which case you would say number one, period. Right? Just, all you have to do is just that, right? Is have this right here. Hang on. That's sort of in a place is very hard to read. And then once again, you've got these tied, accented grace note and principal note. So you have to tell us if that is, or you just have to say a2 with two, right? So don't use divisi and unison. There's a really good video on this with Music Engraving Tips channel, right? So check it out. It's like there are two videos about how to mark your entrances and so on. But check them out, or I've also got some chapters of that in the 100 Orchestration Tips books. So, all right. So there's an overall concern here. We're going to get into the evaluation criteria now. The overall concern of pitch weight in the upper middle register of the piano score. So that's not a concern because you have big full scoring, hugely beefy scoring in here. All right. And then thematic material repeats often, possibly sounding repetitive if orchestrated exactly the same way twice. Right? So you have little subtle differences. Here you don't go yet dun 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 on top with the piccolo, right? Or with the bassoons below. But is that difference all that noticeable, right? And then here, you take away the piccolo and you don't have your horns right in here. Hang on, I'm finding this hard to read. Transposing score, and let's go to treble clef there on the horns. Okay. All right, there we go. That's all readable now. So here's the concern, right? If you are if this piece is going to be played a bunch of times, are you going to be satisfied with these four pairs of bars essentially being orchestrated nearly identically, right? More or less sounding the same, right? I mean, there are a few little changes right in here of like who goes where and so on. Hang on. Let's just make a slight optimize the selection vertically. All right, there we go. So are you going to be happy with that? Right? I mean, the little changes in here aren't really all that audible because like the instruments that are getting the most attention are the same, right? The melody instruments are pretty much orchestrated the same way, and there isn't like a big textural difference. And of course, like with your C trumpet right in here, and how many C trumpets, right? Is this the first trumpet, the second trumpet player? How many and of what, right? This is like all three players playing at once? I need to know. Yeah, and that's some awfully high scoring there for your bass clarinet player. Right. Right. So this is the German system. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just gonna. This is kind of driving me nuts. Sorry. Okay. Sorry, everybody. All right. Let's change to. Bass clarinet. We're going to add that to the score. No, we're not going to change anything. So treble clef, right? So I'm just going to take this whole thing and drop it onto there. All right, there we go. So that's more like it. And then once again, optimize everything. Okay. Sorry about all that stuff. I suppose I could have done that at the beginning, but yeah. So that's just so much more readable. Okay. So try to adopt the that's what they call sort of the French system, which is what's used by bass clarinetists today, rather than the German system, which is no longer used. And it's like that whole use the bass clef most of the time and have it be like a half step difference and everything else, right? So this is the right way to do it. Okay. Just learn to transpose sounding down a major ninth. Okay, you can do it. You are, if you have put this much work into it, you're obviously getting better. Your score reading chops are getting better. Everything else, you can do it. All right. So, all right, let's just talk about the way that this is orchestrated. All right. So once again, like giving me a clue of how much weight is on this. Is this two trombones? Is this one? Is this two trumpet players? Do you change from two or three trumpet players on one voice to a single one here? And then a lot of decisions, this is similar to the previous score. A lot of the decisions you're making seem to be based on the concept of a single voice on each staff. When you have the option of having 2-3 voices depending on the staff. Right? You could be playing chords with your trumpets. You could be playing intervals with your oboes, and so on. If you see what I mean. You have a lot of interesting decisions here. Like, for instance, like here you're doubling the oboes with the English horn, and here you have the English horn above the oboes. Which, I mean, it should work. It should be fine, but it's just going to be sort of a kind of it's a strange order, right? It doesn't, and then of course, like when you have the trumpets blasting away here in the middle, right? They could easily overwhelm any kind of other thing you're doing. So you have the English horn doubling the trumpets, right? And the trumpets, if this is 3 trumpets, then it will be so much louder than the English horn, you will not hear the English horn at all, right? And yeah, and then we have the B flat clarinets here, and I mean, it's still like, now don't get me wrong, I'm going to be critiquing this and so on. Um, there's more right to what's going on here than wrong, but it's just certain positions of things are a little peculiar, right? Like for instance, you've got you're playing the mediant at the bottom. So we have this, instead of bum 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 bum, we have this boom 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 really low. Yeah, I mean that's fine. I mean it's an acquired taste, right? Um, to approach it that way, but it's still fine. And I like the fact that you really hit you hit the tonic of the chord really hard here at the beginning every two bars. So, I mean, what would make this more different is if you hit that tonic really hard with timpani, right? If you just really slammed it one, right? And maybe had like some other percussion instrument there, like maybe a crash, like a crash on the cymbals or something like that. Then I think that would be enough of a difference between these two pairs of bars for it to really sound like you were progressing the texture, even that simple little trick, right? And the same thing, like, what's the contrabassoonist doing? Well, why aren't they doing this here, right? So I don't understand. Like sometimes you leave out certain things that would be very convenient, or so. Okay, so like, in general, it's fine. Like, you've got octaves in trumpets, trombones, bass trombone, tuba. Okay, so the thing is, like, you've got all this weight on the B, and then you have weaker instruments supplying the mediant below. So something has to fix that, right? If you really want that mediant, the major third of the chord, to stand out, then probably the best solution would be to give the bass trombone part just to your second trombone player, right? And then you've got those pitches covered, and then the bass trombone and the tuba can support these G sharps, right? So I mean, there's that would be one example of how you could address that. So our next sort of mirrored sections, we have our two B sections. If you think of this as A1 and A2, this is B1 and B2, although of course they go in vastly different directions. So I think that this was intended to be like a grace note, so you can't play two pitches at once on a single instrument, right? And you only have one piccolo, so watch out for things like that. So this is kind of interesting. You go, so I'm just kind of curious as to why, the trumpets kind of get this, the continuity of the line in the trumpets is fine, right? But then we have this rushing up, and then everybody joins in, dropping down to the next register, right? And here you're kind of going into a weaker area for the flute. So why couldn't the flute have stayed higher and then dropped down after the A, with the piccolo taking over on the high notes? This, by the way, should be, oops, darn it. That should be a B, right? Da 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 B da 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 da. Okay. Now, there's the other problem here of, like, you're rushing up, you're sort of pushing up to this A, and you're still fortissimo, right? So, and you're going up to a very high penetrating note, and then suddenly you're not there anymore. So, what happens afterwards, even though the music is continuing on in a very emphatic way, you're still going to feel the absence of the trumpet, right? Maybe if the trumpet were not even there at all, right? Maybe if you just had a little bit of trumpet at the beginning here, and then everybody else reacting, then you're solving the problem of just dropping off a cliff here dynamically. And then, as far as the treatment of the melody here, I think it's really good that you're sort of keeping the piccolo in the background, but why does the piccolo drop down to a very weak register here? There's absolutely nothing wrong with the piccolo player going up like this, right? Just going up in a straight line. So here's where the harp, I mean, okay. So here's the thing. Like, all right, your, excuse me, your your violin players do not need the ottava mark. All right, they can read this perfectly fine without the ottava, and also ledger lines all the way up to that high E really kind of does show, look, there are consequences to going that, like if you really are going to send up the players up that high, when you have the ottava mark over it, sort of, yeah, just ottava, right? But when you don't have it there, it's like, oh yeah, wow, that is really going high, right? So you really are thinking about that height. So by going up to this height, you're going up to an area that is fairly squeaky, right? So those pitches are going to need to be supported by somebody, right? So why can't it be the piccolo? Or why can't the piccolo be doubling all the way up to that high spot there? And then here, like, everything kind of drops down. So like you got your horn here suddenly coming in, at F below middle C, and then trumpet coming in at, and so like just the sudden start right here, of everybody at a lower pitch. I feel it just sort of drags the melody downwards, right? And I'm wondering about this crescendo mark that we've got here with missing. It seems like missing information, right? So it's fine if you just stop here and then just have fortissimo here, but you don't need this hairpin here, because like what this suggests to me is that maybe you were intending to double this line, but then you never got around to putting in the notes, right? That's what that sort of tells me. So it makes me think that you could have put in a lot more support for the melody rushing up to this E, and here we have the seconds doing absolutely nothing, right? And same thing for our oboes. They could be playing, and the flutes. They could be doubling from below at the octave and just really helping this rush up to here, rather than having kind of piccolos in their weaker register. Like, this is kind of the weakest area of the piccolo, and it is not really going to be all that much stronger on this E compared to everything else that's going on. And the lower brass here sort of rushing up and then suddenly dropping, right? So it almost feels like you're pulling the rug out from under, even though you have harp and violin kind of rushing up there to that high E. It still kind of feels like you're pulling the rug out from under the momentum, right? The upward pushing momentum right in here. Okay, so here we get to the place where if you had completely stuck to the kind of upper middle register scoring, then I would say, and it was continuing on, I would say, oh, that's pretty relentless, right? Now here, I would say it still is kind of relentless in a way, because it's sort of like it's the same kind of approach that happened before, right? Now it's fuller, there's no question. It's just like, it is more of like a sort of a brass and winds chorale with some strings kind of audible in there, right? If you have this much fullness to the texture and this much harmony and everything else, then really what should be happening here in the strings, rather than like doubling some of these functions, it should be more like octaves, right? So like if you have octaves in your strings and the octaves are supported by elements in the winds, and then the winds play more harmony and then the brass are playing harmony below, then it makes it feel as if the strings are actually playing a bunch of different pitches, not just the octaves. But the problem here is that you've got piccolo doubling these three E's, right? And then you've got all these other kind of supporting players in a register where they will get blasted out by the brass, right? The brass is just going to be so much more powerful than the winds here at fortissimo. So, the other option that you could be doing is just really pushing your strings up, like having your strings play up much higher, including the viola, and having the winds up there along with the strings, right? And more than they are kind of down in this lower area where they would just get, like I say, it's just smothered by the brass. So I think that you would sort of need to rethink this, right? And with that increased clarity, then I think you would have the contrast with the previous section a lot more, right? It's sort of a tricky thing, asking the wind players to play exactly the same pitches as the brass and so on, right? There sort of needs to be more of a tiered approach when you have these massive tutis, so that the brass don't just obliterate the winds and strings while they're at it, right? If the strings are scored too low, right? So you have this, this E, B, 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 and that's kind of, a lot of those pitches are covered by different, much stronger instruments, right? So maybe a little bit of rethinking is in order right in here. But I mean, I do like this, let's see, this is cool. Trading off to the marcato strings and so on. Yeah. So a lot of times, like, some of your lines don't really have a total continuity, right? You have this up, 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 and they sort of don't follow through. There are gaps on things. Try to have the things sort of connecting to each other, following through a little bit more cohesively. All right, and I think that you'll just get much better scoring results out of it, right? Like, for instance, this little set of notes down here just kind of drops off the bottom a little bit. It is fattening up to a degree what's going on here in the cellos, but it's just those horns are so much stronger than the cellos, right? And the bassoons, that, yeah. I mean, it's just a little. I know you're throwing in a little dash of color in there, but I mean, what is it doing otherwise, right? But still, I mean, I just really love the manic energy that you've got right in here. Very, very cool. Now, here at B, you just have really hugely intense scoring in right here, and I'm wondering if there's some way of sort of simplifying it a little bit. Like, when you kind of use the C trumpet or trumpets, I'm still not sure whether you intend like more than one. When you're using the trumpet, this much, right, as the melody instrument, where's the chance for some of the other players to kind of come out and shine, right? It's just really, there's a real sort of kind of wind band or brass band quality of it, right? So it's hard to sort of hear the contribution of the strings or other instruments to that. And the same thing is true, like in this case, you've got the C trumpet or trumpets playing very, very intensely on, right in the middle of the range. And, and here we've got the flutes in like their weakest range, that just right there, that first octave is so weak, right? So how can the flute hope to contribute anything meaningful here? And then the piccolo here will just be absorbed by the sound of the violins and the trumpets and the oboe doubling below it, right? So that just like this little touch right in here and these other little touches will be kind of swallowed up by the resonance above. So like the whole flute family here is probably something you could cut. Now, or you could cut so much activity going on here in the trumpets, in the horns and so on, right? So this, you can hear the intensity of those octaves that you have scored here, right? It's just like they really dominate. They just take over the whole sound picture, and there's very little in terms of doubling going on with the violins and so on. Now, if you had scored this, like, say, maybe the viola could take over some of this middle voice function, and you had your second violins playing this, and you had your first violins an octave higher, and they were doubled by the flutes, then wow, you would really hear them, right? So, and going up here instead of down. So, yeah, so there's, like, right here in the evaluation criteria, like, contrast of color, breadth of texture, and middle register scoring was the original criterion here. So, like, the concern was that in the score, in the original piano score, Falla is really limiting the sound picture to, just like right to the middle of the piano, where on the previous screen, he was limiting it to like the first two octaves above middle C, right? So it was still kind of a limited sound picture. Now, you have got a breadth of texture going on here, right? But are there that many contrasts of color, right? So like the contrast of color mainly seems to be whether or not the brass are taking over certain functional lines or not, right? So like for instance here, like you've got the C trumpet taking over that, you've got the trombone playing the sort of middle harmonization, and so on, and then right in here that sort of accompaniment right in there, and continuing on with the middle line, but the melodic function has gone to sort of flutes, oboes, and violins, right? That's the contrast that are going on there, contrast of color, but like still it's all very just because the scoring is just so intense with the brass being involved all of the time. I feel it's limiting to a certain degree just how much color you could be playing with, right? And then in terms of maintaining differentiated roles and closely spaced melodies and overlapping accompaniment figures and highlighting inner voices, I think that one of the problems in here is just like working out the balance of those things. Like for instance, there are certain features here that come off a little bit poorly because they're so much surrounded by other stronger elements. Like we already talked about how the flute will just get swallowed up by most of the time by what's going on with the trumpets. And here, even though there aren't trumpets playing, the range, the register right in here will basically just go to the oboes if it can be heard, right, over the sound of the very active brass around it. So you just kind of have to work out some of those balances. I just feel that a lot of this can just be solved by just easing off on so much, on the presence of the brass. Just trying to use it very, very sparingly, right? And then just trying to keep weaker instruments, or trying to keep certain instruments out of weaker registers when you have very intense scoring. Yeah, and, for instance, like this is all really nice and strong. This is going to be mostly like Sol G scoring. But is there anything that could intensify this line by doubling, like bass clarinet? Could the bass clarinet be doubling this instead of just doing these little things that are being covered by other stronger instruments anyways, right? Could we do something to bring this out a little bit more? Or like here, like this English horn will just kind of get covered by what's going on around it, right? So I think that this still needs a little bit of work right in here. Although, like, the overall effect of what it is very, very cool, right? But like, do the lines inside balance? Not exactly, right? So I think you just need to kind of go back and see whether or not there are, do you need to, for instance, like, can you just leave this in the bass? Does it need to be doubled an octave higher by the horns, right? You just have to sort of think about some of those things. And these high interjecting E's, that was another concern. I don't think that they are as much, like, in the way that you've scored this, they don't play a huge role, and they're not distracting or anything. So that's not a big concern. But now going forward into this next part, keeping the triplets from overwhelming the melodic line. So I'm not sure about this. Was this supposed to be connected like this? Or wait a second, that doesn't make sense. Yeah, because there's so I don't understand what's going on here. Why are these? All right, so is that what it was supposed to be? On the tuba, there's only one pitch available, right? So maybe you intended something more like this. Right. Maybe that was what was intended. Anyways, I don't understand, but okay, so the big concerns in here in this scoring are keeping triplets from overwhelming the melodic line, above, and widely reaching left hand patterns. All right, so the I don't think that that is a concern. I think some more of the concern is like putting some of the functions in different registers, like for instance, like putting the bass line way up high in the flutes, right? Or not slurring, right? So I think that these all need to be slurred. Down, 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 like just really, so that it isn't da 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 da, right? And then you have some things that really almost can't be slurred, right? Like you've got these, bum 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 in the which I feel doesn't have as much grace as like the way the clarinets are scored in here. Essentially it's the same notes, right? We've got sounding C, right? C way down here, and then we've got sounding B and E. B and E, and then this will be B and E, like doubling the clarinets, right? So I think you need to restore the slurs, and then maybe like, do you just really want this kind of yappa ba 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 kind of scoring right in there? Yeah, it's kind of hard to control. There's these sforzandos sort of floating around. I'm not sure. So I guess maybe they're leftover artifacts from these low pitches. So yeah, so anyway, yeah. So just I would say try to be a little bit more uniform with certain functions, and I think that the meaning of the music will come out more. Like, I mean, I love the way that you're just that you are trying out different things, and throwing in some very cool little lines and so on, and switching the order of certain things to sort of explore the different effects. And where it works, it's great, but where it doesn't, I think you should back off, right, a little bit. So I think the widely reaching left hand patterns, I think that works very nicely the way that you've got it scored. It's pretty weighty throwing in the tuba. I mean, does the tuba need to be there all the time? Could the tuba ease off as we start getting lighter? Could you possibly lighten the texture with each 4 bars? Like coming in strong here, say for 8 bars, and then as you start to ease out of those first 8 bars of this part, start subtracting instruments, right? So this is half the weight, and then this is a quarter of the weight, and that would involve like easing up on maybe so much intensity going on here in the brass, and so much doubling. Could you end up with no bassoons, right? And just having the bass clarinet and the double basses working together, right? And less of these accompanying instruments. So you just have to realize that piccolo is so weak, right, in this lowest octave. It's sort of like it's almost like a song flute next to the titans of the orchestra, the brass right in here, right? So yeah, I feel like the piccolo will get swallowed in here. So like, if you wanted this effect to come out stronger, right, then give it to the flutes, and then put, if you want this little effect to be more effective up there, then you give it to some tuned percussion instrument like glockenspiel or something like that, to have that chiming above. And then you have the stronger appearance of the triplets higher, and so on. Now, as to the treatment of the melody, I think that deserves a little bit of commentary. It's very, very much spread out, and it's sort of swallowing. There's something similar happens towards the end of at the very end of your orchestration, like the very last section. you've got a similar melody to this, just very, very long and slow. And it's just really absorbing the sounds of everything that's around it. So it's kind of like the opposite concern. Now we're not so worried about the triplets being lost here, because just because of how you're spreading them all across the orchestra and everything else, and that's fine. But we've got you got the melody. You got some melody notes being played very low by trombone here, and then coming up to play the octaves, and then of course like also bass clarinet being involved and so on. And I mean it's chilling, right? It's a beautiful idea, but there are some instruments, once again, like, you know, how can low flutes be heard right here when you've got the trumpet playing mezzo forte crescendo, right, sforzando accent there. The flutes just basically can't do, you know, they have nothing really meaningful to contribute there in terms of their timbre. You know, it's like not like the mixture of them with the trumpets will really accomplish anything. Now, the mixture of the oboes with the trumpets will really do something. You know, this is where the oboes get nice and pungent and everything else. And so long as the trumpets do not blast out too loudly, like say if this were one trumpet and it was marked mezzo forte, and this were the, you know, A2 oboes and they were marked forte, then you would get a nice balance, right? And then adding all of those three elements together with the violins, you get this very beautiful, intensely warm sound, right? But I mean, still, it's just like it's just a wonderful. Like you're coming up with some wonderful colors in here. Like there's a part of me that doesn't want to mess with it too much, right? Because there's a lot of things that work really nicely. The bassoon right in here, and so on. The role of the English horn here. I feel that is also pretty strong, right? And you know, there's some doubling here. You've got the bassoon. So if you've got the bassoon playing this right in here, why did we even need the trombone, right? Why can't these instruments just sort of just go away a little bit and just let the winds and the strings speak out a little bit more along some of these wonderful lines that you've got? And then of course, absolutely slur all of your triplets. So here at C, I noticed that you've got the pedal mark sort of imported from the original piano score, which of course, it does not need to be there. Notice that I've got like parentheses, right? So it was sort of intended for the pedal mark to look sort of like this, and the parentheses marks to be around it. All right, so kind of showing, hey, you know, in the piano score, this translates as that, and so on. And I feel like there's some missing notes in here. Kind of, I'm wondering if I ended up doing that, if there was something about it, about the template score. I think that like in the future I might just have like you know, stems, if you know what I mean, like just have the have a melody stem and have an accompaniment stem and a bass stem and so on and so forth that is already sort of fragmented from the piano part, and then you can mix and match and so on, however you like in the next evaluation. Okay, but looking at this. Let's think about what that pedal mark means, right? So if you're playing this on piano, you're going to hit the down, you're going to hit the right. So did you intend? Right. So I'm just kind of not sure what you intended here. Like if you intended these notes to be played. Right, because it sort of kind of doesn't make sense without them there, right? All right. Okay, so let's assume that that's what you intended. Okay, so the pianist is playing each note in the piano score, and as each new pitch is introduced, it sustains all the way to the end of the bar, right? So is there something that we could be doing in the scoring here rather than just basically interpreting the individual notes that are written in the piano part? Could we be doing things like, you know, as you hit this D, maybe like the clarinet grabs that same D and then sustains it, right? And then as you get the G sharp, maybe the next clarinet plays the same note and sustains it, right? And so instead of letting go of these notes when you get to the end of the bar, these sounding B flats sustain longer and so on. So you know what I mean? So that like there's a sense that each pitch as it's introduced has a cumulative effect of, and then that becomes more powerful, right? And that gives some meaning to this. Like you've got the parentheses forte crescendo, but like there's nothing to crescendo from, and here we actually don't even have any pitches at all, right? So some of the scoring could have been organized a little bit more, more cohesively, more, just and also like what's the pitch, what's the dynamic here? Is it fortissimo and then we ease off into forte, which is actually kind of what I prefer. I sort of like pushing this all the way up to fortissimo and then backing off a little bit to forte or mezzo forte. I think that's a really good effect. So that would be what we call an allargando, right? So it's an enlarging of the sound picture. All right. So that leads us to here. So, is there any way to give this poor tuba player the day off or the passage off, right? So we've been using so much heavy. That's just it'll give so much weight to your, just so much heaviness in your scoring. It was kind of strange. So I vertically optimized it, and I just ended up with things that were too close together anyway. It's kind of strange. It's a little selective, the optimization in Sibelius. Now, they really should have given Daniel Spreadbury and his team more time to work on it. Anyhow, it's probably because of these elements are pushing things apart in an unnatural way. Okay, so let's start with the melody. Okay, so careful treatment of the melodic voice to make it feel authentic to the composer's style. So essentially, it is oboe doubling with violins, right? And then here the violins get a little higher. We're getting up to the flute and so on with the oboe doubling below, and some trumpet in there. Okay, so that's all good. So, but here you're saying bien chantant, all right? So well sung, very expressive, of the melody and so on. So it's got to be like, you have to tell the player what that means with nuances, right? With hairpins, right? So, and make sure that your slurs, like for instance, like slurring over a slur, right? That's more of a piano thing. So like we can get rid of that one. But what about slurs here, right? Maybe add some slurs in there just to kind of make it feel more connected. Could we be slurring across here? That creates an effect called portato, right? Which is, it is not a small root vegetable. It is a fun way of pulsing the melody, right? So it's almost like a sobbing sound, right? So dum dum dum, right? So, and could we put in like a little crescendo and diminuendo, crescendo more diminuendo? So that's basically what this would mean, right? So like very expressive. So show us what that means in terms of adding expression marks, right? And or you don't have to have this. You don't have to have this slurred if you really want this, right? You could have these individually bowed, right, or articulated. Okay, so this is just barely possible what you're asking the players to do. So I can't remember if I mentioned this in the pitfalls. Did you watch that? Did you watch the announcement video, Anthony, where I mentioned the pitfalls? Yeah, and then I have the. I tried to get everybody to watch the 12 common scoring errors video. So there were a couple of things that show up later in your score that relate to that. Okay, so the thing about it is that it just, just this kind of back and forth sort of stuff. And I know you're trading off between instruments. You're trying to give each player a break a little bit, right? I mean, it is sort of possible, but like just kind of the sort of pinpoint kind of accuracy of it, it gets to be sort of wearing after a while, right? And there's also the feature to it that like on the piano part, since there's pedal going on, it has this beautiful kind of light-filled, effortless sort of feeling to it, rather than the real back and forth, yeah, dee do dee do dee do dee do dee do dee do dee. So it would be kind of, it's possible but damn irritating, right, for your wind players. And then it is easily possible but like somewhat pedestrian, right? And then when we get to here, right, this real just kind of aggressive stuff right in here. We sort of lose that sense that this is somehow like starting to release the hidden fire, right? Because we've just sort of had that saying, yeah, kind of stuff, just kind of pacing onwards, right? So if there's any different way of interpreting this, right, you must have seen a zillion different ways by now if you've been following along, and so just there's got to be. I just feel like that it also feels very paced. Like because it's very difficult to slur this kind of thing. If there's some way of dividing it up, right, between certain parts of this, like you've already got the lower motion being tracked by contrabassoon and so on, which is going to be very grunty, by the way, just this really really low. You've got double basses and contrabassoon playing the lowest possible thing, and then the tuba is going to be above that, right? What if instead of accenting every single one of these, what if this was slurred, right? What if this was being played? What if these were being played like accented? Excuse me. What if the lower line here was being played with a tenuto staccato, this sort of sticky. It's almost like touching and lifting your finger off of a piece of Scotch tape, the sticky side, right? This has this kind of sticky, bouncy kind of a sound. And what if the part above was going, just kind of having this kind of slightly off the eighth kind of a pulse to it? Then I think that you would get a similar thing, and then everything could play really smoothly instead of being so, disconnected and kind of annoying to the player. And then here you can just go to straight staccato, and bring in more energy, right? And then that makes this da 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 da, or just in your trombone and bass trombone just sounds all that more evil, right? I think that would work great. Yeah. And then they're just like aesthetic choices, like if you have this beautiful combination of oboe and violin, and then you add the trumpet to it, which really starts to take over the sound. Do you even need the violins and the oboe anymore? Can you just have the trumpet sort of commenting, coming in and adding its voice, and then it's just up to you, like how much of this. It's interesting. You have clarinet, da 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 da, and then it goes back to the do dee do dee do dee do dee do dee kind of thing. Right. So, is there some way of rethinking the accompaniment here? That's really the issue, right? I would say. Yeah, and it's interesting that the harp, which would solve a lot of your problems, isn't used. And I'm not saying that as a critique. I'm saying that as like that I think that's really great, because it would just be so easy to throw so much of the piano part onto the harp, and you didn't do that, right? So, that is brilliant. That's awesome. And then, the treatment of the melody and the ritardando or rallentando, then poco animato. I think that like the way that you scored it fits the fluctuations of tempo very well. Okay, so watch out and things like this. So if I recommend a hairpin, or a dashed hairpin, then just use it and put in a real hairpin, right? So this is just a suggestion. I'm saying, hey, this is what pianists do, right? So if you want to use this, you can do the same thing, but what does a Scorpion's lyric make it real, not fantasy, right? So just. Oh, where did that disappear to? Hang on a second. Let me try that again. It's strange. I see. It's hiding behind the dashed one. Right, so just make it a real hairpin. Right. Okay, so I liked the way that you like you pushed into this and you brought in more voices. But like once again, I feel like you could be using more trombones. This is strange. You have two voices. You've got one instrument and you've got two voices here. So I think that this got mixed up with the trombone part or whatever. But anyhow, you have all these horns. You've got more winds. Essentially, you're just really using one voice of each most of the time, right? Except for the occasional accident where you have two voices. Maybe this was intended to be and it just sort of ended up weird. But okay, so just using multiple voices in a way that's just very effortlessly pushing into this and having it fuller. Da, 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 da. Wouldn't it be great to throw in some epic orchestral sweep right in here? Just really a fuller voice. Okay, what's going on here? I see. This is strange. Disappearing notes. I wonder if that's something inherent to how I scored things. Like if you ended up trading a note for a rest, if it ended up coming out as an invisible note rather than an invisible rest. That's probably what happened. Okay, so apologies for that. I just, I think I'm just going to go with like individual. I'll have the standard next. I've already decided on this next challenge. I'm going to have like the standard piano part, and then I'm going to have beneath that I'm going to have the threads, right? So you can just like have the melodic thread and the accompaniment thread if there's any complexity to the accompaniment, and there is in this next selection. Then that might be expressed by two separate kinds of lines. So maybe accompaniment 1, accompaniment 2, bass, and then it may be also melody 2 that will have its own staff. All right, and this is all great. Just absolutely. I really love this teaming up bass clarinet with the cellos. This is a little strange. You can fix this real easily, Anthony, if you need to. In Sibelius, just grab a hold of the beam and hike it up. You know what Sibelius really needs? Sibelius developers who are out there listening, probably not, is a normalize button, right? So like you can have beams set a certain way because they were taken from another part and they had to be, but just like grab a bar and just like have shift command whatever key that hasn't been used yet, and that just normalizes, like brings all of the values back to normal and takes away anything weird. Okay. And now this is kind of cool. Okay, so it's cool and it's not cool. All right. So here's the thing: is that like we don't get any push from below, right? You just have a couple of low notes, and you've taken the bass part and you put it in the clarinet, up 2 octaves higher, right? So the thing is that we don't get this like sense of leaping from below, the kind of the real dancey, and also this doesn't set up this, right? So that's the other problem, right? So I mean I see what you're doing. You want this to end on the same note, and then that gets going with your bass clarinet and so on. Okay, and there are some problems here, right? So, but I just feel that like this just really like there's so much power in the way that this is scored for the left hand of the piano. I think we're missing that, right? They're just like we don't have that wonderful gutsy energy from below, and what's more, the rhythm of this, which pushes into these chords, is missing too, right? So because it's very, very, it's very lightweight, right? There isn't a lot. Like there was a touch of contrabassoon right in there, but it doesn't really have that same push, right? So maybe reconsider this, I would say. But I love the little reaction here. That's very, very cool. And then, all right, so here we're getting into, agitato. This is just really, this, you would have to be like a bass clarinet concerto player to get this, right? So you have to rethink this. That's all I'm going to say, okay? So, conceptually, you have a lot of really strong things in here. But, in terms of practical scoring, some of those conceptual heights are you do beautifully, and then other places like this is just too fast. for what you're intending to do, right? So I think this was definitely one of the pitfalls in the announcement, and that is like interpreting broken octaves, like the whole just imagine, try to sing this and go bop at the beginning of each pitch, boppy 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 boppy. It's just, if you can't sing it, you probably can't play it on the instrument, right? Yeah, and just stuff like this. Yeah, that's just really intense. So I mean, it would be a great cadenza kind of passage for a really, really, really great bass clarinet player. But even at that, I think that they would find it very difficult, and they might spend months or weeks or whatever just trying to get this passage right. So don't, I would say avoid that level of complexity of difficulty for the player. It's not complex, but the level of difficulty for the player. Yeah. All right. So I'm noticing a few of these little, plain text dynamics, and it's suggesting to me that perhaps the dynamics that you've been using in the score are, mainly just, copy pasted from the, so check this out. All right. So I'm going to delete that little guy there. All right. So let's say you want to go to mezzo forte here, right? So I'm going to rest my thumb on the command key with my left hand, and then I'm going to reach over with my index finger, and I'm going to press the E button. Now I'm going to leave my thumb. My thumb is still sitting on the command key or control key if you're on PC. Then I'm just going to reach over. My right finger is going to type M, and my left finger is going to, with my thumb still sitting on that key, is going to type the F, right? And then I get a beautifully engraved, because like otherwise it's just like this, right? It's just like this is really hard to read. So there's a reason why this is sort of bold italics, and then also very stylized, right? So it's just so really, really easy to read for the player. So yeah, so just remember, just leave your thumb sitting on the command key as you type the dynamics in Sibelius, and it's just the easiest keyboard shortcut in the world. Okay, so that I've said everything I'm going to say about this. Just rethink this, okay? But I mean, it's a great idea, but it's not going to really work, with a standard orchestra. If you had an orchestra of virtuosos, but we can't count on that, right? We're thinking of an orchestra of really solid working players. Okay, so just going forward into more of D. So watch out for your copy pasting. Like you got a pizzicato mark here on your piccolo, right? So watch out for things like that. And then, things like this, really that should be like a cordino, right? Not like all of this here, somehow it ended up. Right, okay, so starting off here, it's kind of strange. You have pizzicato mart on this right in here, and you've got slurs, right? So it sort of doesn't make sense, right? And then once again, we've got the problem with the broken octaves and so on. It's like just imagine trying to pluck this, pluck, 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 in the cello. Like I mean, it's just barely manageable. Like at 132, it's just so hard. I mean. Yeah, so you need to rethink this, right? It could just be repeated notes, couldn't it? Like yada da 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 da. I mean, that could just be easier, right? All right. The main problem here, though, is the harp. Okay, so I mean, it's a beautiful idea to bring harp in here. Okay, but then once again, you're bringing in your brass. So how can the harp be heard over the brass? And we don't have there's like no dynamic marks here, so that means that whatever the brass were set to previously, like if it was fortissimo or whatever, or forte, they'll just be really, really loud in the playback, or they'll just think that they're loud in performance, right? So you need to tell us what dynamic this is. So let's just assume that this is like soft, but it's still like the horns right in here. It's just still too much weight for the harp, even if the horns were soft and the trombones were soft and the bass trombone was soft. It's still too much weight for the harp to sound clearly. right? So there's just a bunch of things that are a bit uh, they kind of are mutually exclusive, right? So like slurs on pizzicato, right? Um, like a slur on a pizzicato usually means that you intend to sort of slide or hammer on or pull off, you know, similar to like a guitar note. Yeah, and you know, and also like ties are, you know, ties for longer. I mean, I think you could get away with this tie, but it's still kind of unnecessary, right? Yeah. So I mean, and some of this is just kind of like piano phrasing, anyways, right? So yeah, yeah. Once again, I need to know like, is this first trombone? Is it two trombones, and so on? And you know, you're using more voices per instrument, right? So here we're starting to get into thirds and so on. Like you could have more of one kind of instrument and less having to put in all of the different instruments just to build up a harmony. Do you see what I mean? So like you know, if you are if you like, whenever you want to do a four note chord, if you're using four different staves, right? Then like you could be playing those same four notes with just two instrumental staves, with two instruments grabbing, you know, two instruments on each staff covering that four note chord. Okay, but like, you know, we're running into some similar problems again. I mean, I think that here you could sort of get away with these low flutes if everybody's playing very soft. I think that it would sort of more or less work. And the pizzicato in here, but then like it just, yeah, you know, and then you have the horns coming in right in here. So like at this point from here, I think the harp just becomes very difficult to hear, right? And then there's the other thing, the other issue, you know, I would say I have a bone to pick with you here, right? So there are like gaps, right? And these gaps are puzzling me. A lot of arrangers would have like areas where there would just be a big dropout, and it would happen in this section right in here, the big build up to the huge tutti at, you know, in the middle of D. So why? I mean, why are the horns coming to an end here? You know, why aren't they? You know, is it because the trombones are taking over here? But then, what about the contrabassoon's role here? Why is the contrabassoon playing two voices when it's a single instrument? Right. So, but it's the gaps really that are disturbing me, because like the thing about a tutti is you can't just do that, right? You can't just use an instrument in a big cohesive texture. I'm overusing the word cohesive, in a big full texture like this that really like continues on from point A to point B in a slow boil, right? You can't just leave instruments out, right? You add instruments and you add instruments and you add instruments until you have finally this big huge push right at the end. So yeah, don't do that. Don't drop out things. Add things cumulatively, right? And then I think it just is a much stronger score. I love the fact that you let the bass clarinetist rest, right? But once again, this just really has to be rethought. I think you could have you could have maybe the cellos like repeating notes going, you know, yada da 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 da, and just having the bass clarinet catch the bottom note in staccato, doink 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 doink, right? And then the same thing here. Your bassoon and contrabassoon could be going boink 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 boink, and the cellos could be playing octaves yada da 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 da. You know what I mean? Um, yeah. So why aren't the cellos lower, or excuse me, why aren't the cellos higher here? So like you're setting up the pattern, higher, lower, even lower, right? So but why are the cellos low here, doubling the double basses? Shouldn't they be up higher, right? Just like the bassoons. And then why does the contrabassoon drop out, and so on? So, you know, why can't the tuba be higher and lower and higher and lower, right? And there's just a huge amount of weight here. You know, couldn't some of this be played, like right in here you got this harmony. Couldn't the harmony be played by the second trombone, and then leaving the bass trombone to do their work as a bass player, right? Rather than this middle stuff. You give a lot of middle scoring, like middle register of the orchestra scoring to your bass trombonist when you've got a second trombonist who that's their job, right? Is to like, and then here we can see we got the harmony in the trombones. That's great, right? So the bass player is perfectly happy, sort of playing lower on the bass staff, and this is great in here. You got the harmony here. That's all great, but then here you're giving the harmony to your bass player instead of having the bass player do the perfectly normal job of doubling with the tuba. And then when you do that, if your bass trombonist can double up with the tuba, then maybe they could play, octave, higher octave, lower octave, higher octave, lower octave, and so on to sort of to support the lower strings, right? If they were scored the same way that they are in the piano score all the way through. Yeah, so just little functional things. Yeah. All right, so just one other thing here is that you're starting off with just beautiful high, like everybody is in their perfect place here. This is really, really nice. Okay, and then here you drop the octave while keeping the strings high. And then, like just blasting away still with your trombones and your trumpets, right? So you're forcing your winds down into a place where they'll be just absorbed and smothered and disappeared by the brass, whereas you could just keep everybody high, right? Just keep them up in that higher range, all the way across, right? What's the need to go lower here, right? Can't you just keep them up there and they're, where they're nice and juicy? The oboe could be down here, though. Excuse me. Sorry. But yeah, it's still... Anyhow. Right. So just a few little things, like if you have intervals in your strings, you got to tell us if this is divisi or non-divisi, right? And once you set a certain approach, then you have got to stick to it. And right here, we have the added problem that slurring over tenuto marks is a portato, right? And then going onwards, like you usually wouldn't put a big slur like this that covers portato and then goes on to just kind of slur with one bow, because it's two different kinds of bowing, right? One of it's just kind of this kind of sobbing bowing, right? And then this would be a beautifully bowed passage under one long bow, ya-da-da-da-da, right? So just really, if you want that, that's what you got to do, right? You got to divide this up more, just more definitively, rather than these are sort of, essentially it's the piano phrasing, right? So watch out for putting piano phrasing onto the orchestra. Yeah, but I mean, in general, here I am, and I'm giving you all these little tips and pointers and so on and so forth. But the overall idea of what you want to do is actually pretty strong, right? It's just like some of the approaches that you're using don't work, right? And that there's some careless errors, like intervals in single instruments and so on. So yeah, so just watch out about copy pasting, right, from the piano score. So just think about how does the instrument actually play this, right? What's the procedure? And watch out for dropping the piano slurring onto the just dead onto the part. Okay, so you're leading up to this big mighty ending here. Dun 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 dun. Okay, and here is, I think you missed this in the announcement. I'm going to have to make this a little bit more, I'm going to have a certain strategy to make sure everybody reads the certain warnings and so on and so forth. So I think you missed my warnings about rotating patterns, right? So we're going into a place where in the score, it's trading off between the fingers, and it's very, very easy because you're going left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, and that's it's just it's drumming your fingers, isn't it? It's Right? So that's really, really easy to get, nice and even. But the thing is, like, trading off those individual instances between the players, like, and having them come in on the, on the 16th, like after the 16th beat and so on, in that beautiful sense of precision, that doesn't really quite happen with the orchestra, right? It just would take a kind of precision and focus that it is sort of absent, right? So you would be better having maybe two wind instruments trading off, like, one of them going yada da and the other one going da 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 yada da 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 da, and then you could also just play the rotating pattern on a stringed instrument too, right? Just I'm sure they could easily play all four of those notes because they're all close together, and it's like no big deal. And then you've got the bum 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 bum. You could have that much higher to interact with the pattern. But like the way that this is scored now, I'm just really sorry to say this, Anthony, because like it's a great idea, but it's just not going to, like, logistically, it's not going to work for these players to come in on the on the half beat and the quarter beat and with that unearthly precision that you would need to interpret. This is sort of an exploded rotating pattern across the orchestra, right? And it just is just not going to work the way that this is scored. And then kind of going on, we have a similar problem to the what we had before. Remember I was talking about broken octaves? It's the same thing here. This was also something that was in that announcement, the pitfall. So I'm sorry, it seems like you didn't read that, and I apologize because you ended up spending a lot of time on this just to have me say, well, sorry, Anthony, that doesn't work. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it and sort of make the pain any worse. Okay, I mean, like the idea that you have here, it doesn't work the way that it's scored, but there could be some way of making it workable. Like this, like the tuba here that's dead easy. Bump 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 bump. It's so easy to do, but going it's just like coming in just dead precise in between each eighth note by the violins and the horn and the flute. The flute, which will get, by the way, absorbed. This low flute will get absorbed by the horn, just sucked dry, right? And it'll, like, it's doubling the first violin, but it really isn't adding anything to them, right? So if you were able to make this work, it would really be the oboe that and especially the oboe having the ability to beautifully articulate with pinpoint accuracy, right? So let's not, like, I've mentioned a couple different ways that this could be fixed, and there are some other examples. So I'm not going to get into it, but I think you get the idea, right? And you probably have watched some videos. I mean, I've read some of your comments on other on other scores, so you probably knew this was coming. So I'm not going to get into it too much, but that is sort of the problem. But there are some other fixes that you might see in other scores as a way of getting around some of those problems. Okay, so here we're getting into this beautiful, tranquil section, right? And once again, I'm going to ask, like, why is there so much brass in this, right? So, like, you've just sent them through this big blow, right? Just like they've had that huge section before and now here they have to play really softly and subtly, and there's a beauty to that, right? We're not really quite hearing it in the mock-up. I think that, like, you forgot to mark piano here, so your bass trombone part is like really kind of yelling over everybody else and so on. And then once again, like the string parts here, they all needed to be marked. Like you needed to work on the dynamics here just to make sure that everything was balanced. So that didn't quite come through. Okay, but and there's also the issue of a smooth transition, right, from here into E, right? So we have the rallentando, but it's still very, very dry, going to something that's really, really smooth. So is there any way that you can make this smoother, right, in your ultimate conception of this? Okay, and so we arrive at E. We're the two main concerns here are authenticity of style and choice of melodic voice, more rotating patterns, how to score in a way that maintains interest. If the harp is to be used, how to avoid regularity, predictability. Now here's where you could have used the harp just to really cover a lot of the problems that we're going to be talking about. So but we'll get to that in a second. Let's talk about the melody first. And once again, you know, um, con espressivo, like we need to write out what that means, like with nuances, like crescendo and diminuendo, and so on and so forth. And I feel that this poco a poco decrescendo that's in the piano part is a bit of a cop out, for us orchestrators to use. I'm sorry, I'm not accusing you of being a cop out or anything, Anthony, but it's just like, you know, poco a poco decrescendo. Each of these is sort of like a dynamic, like it fluxes dynamically. So when we put the decrescendo under it, we're sort of like we're forcing everything into this downward ramp, right? Da, da. And then what if there's a little crescendo and diminuendo here? Da, da. Then, to express the decrescendo, we put in a mezzo piano here. Da, da, and then piano here. Da, da. And each of these little kind of pairs of phrases across the bar could have their own little hairpins in them, right? And that way you get beautiful nuance even though we're terracing our way down. Okay, so so some of the problems that we've got here, like I feel like why couldn't the flute just state what it needs to state without all of this doubling, right? Why couldn't the English horn come in underneath at an octave? That's such a beautiful idea, right? So like I feel like you're adding so many things to it, like we're not really hearing the uniqueness. Like so you have all of these great ideas happening in at the same time, right? So it's like great idea A, B, C, and D, right? Why can't we just have great idea A or great idea B and D, right? Why do we have to have all of them at once, right? It's just so much doubling and so much cushioning and so many things going on of what is really like a 2-line phrase, right? Or 3 lines at the most. In the you've got the little accompaniment in the left hand and you've got the melody in the right hand. So there's just so much weight on that melody. Can we ease up a bit, right? Is there some way of just sort of bringing it back? Having said that, I mean there's also like benefits to having things being incredibly thick and insane and intense and so on. I mean that's like Strauss, would have a beautiful passage like this, and it would be so layered with different things happening when there's really like only 1 or 2 functions in the entire passage, but they would be as you do here, there would be, it would be so, like lots of doubling and lots of bouncing off of other instruments and so on and so forth. So if that was your intent here, total respect. Okay. But at the same time, I feel like you've got all these really great ideas, like the horn solo, like that could just basically dominate this whole page. You could just do horn and strings, right? And it would just come out beautifully. Or horn playing an octave below the strings and just have that be what's going on here. So like the problem with the rotating phrases. So let's talk about the implications of the rotating patterns, and I'll come back to the really thick doubling. Okay. So the thing about it is like we can kind of hear what the problem is because of the missing dynamic here. So if we listen to the mock-up, right, like the bass trombone just really starts going da 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 because it's too loud, right? So, but it's not just that it's too loud. That whole da 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 da. That's sort of the sense of like one of the notes really kind of sticking out, right? It's like it's almost like the Scotch tape between the 2 phrases. Like these lines, as scored in the piano part, add up to a rotating pattern of 4 notes that trade off between the hands, right, or between the 2 sides of the left hand for the pianist. Okay, well and good. And then from below we have da 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 da, right, da 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 da, right. So it just adds up to that 4-note pattern. Okay. So the thing about it is that like each of these notes is like the little Scotch tape, right, and when these are being played by very smooth legato instruments, then we see the tape, right? It's like a piece of, it's like these beautiful artworks that were all sort of put together, in a craft project, and you can sort of see the Scotch tape going over the paint, right? That's what it starts to feel like not at first, but then after many bars, you just really start noticing the da 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 dum, right? So how to get around that? So there are ways of getting around that. One is to have a have just you can have the pattern, say maybe in strings and in brass, or in brass and so on, and then you could have another instrument trading off between two players playing the full pattern, right? One of them goes do 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 do, and then the other player takes over on that do 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 do. So it's going, first second, and just like playing over that pattern. So with one of the players, with one of these instruments, one of these pairs of instruments playing over that pattern that's being played in the strings or the brass or both, the sense of the rotation comes back, right? And the notes that are kind of hanging on in each group are not as pronounced. And the other solution is just to throw in the harp. Like the harp has been mostly inactive for this entire piece. Could the harp come in and just be playing that pattern, and just sort of even be playing like permutations of it, right, in different octaves and different voicings and different kinds of things, but just keeping the pattern going over the same pitches in some order or other, so that it distracts from the attention of those longer notes, right? Because even if you do put in the piano mark here, then it's still going to it's still going to be really, really audible, right? That the Scotch tape over the paint, right, is going to really be like what connects the two parts together is just going to take away from the effect of the rotation of the pitches. So that's the big concern that I have right in there, and that was something I think I said in my pitfalls that maybe I would say it's more my fault than yours, right? That I just kind of put it on the end of the announcement without saying everybody has to watch this, right? Because other people got their announcement just from the website, right? Or the announcement on Patreon. So I can't really blame anybody for missing it too much. Okay, but here's the thing is that if you really do want that, let's say that you do, add some harp or some other rotating instrument or whatever, but you still just want that sort of like Straussian fullness or Mahlerian fullness to this. Okay, that I totally accept that. So if you're able to sort of cover cover up the glue, right, between the two parts, then in that case, the doubling of this melodic line makes perfect sense, right? Because you want this line to be really you just really want it to be powerful and to in some way like work together with the everything else that's going on. So I would just say if that is the case, then we need to be really logical about what works and what doesn't, right? So if you have trumpet pretty much for the whole line, what does the trumpet do to all the other instruments that are doubling it, right? Which instruments are going to work best to kind of make this work together, rather than making kind of a very thick kind of more like a wind band kind of a sound? What's going to make it sound more orchestral? Now, yes, you do have the doubling on the strings. So if it really is a case of coloring the strings, then mezzo forte, this should be piano, right? Your doubling in your brass and your winds need to serve the string texture, right? So you could have, I would say, pick one or the other. Don't have both flute or clarinet. Just pick one or the other, either flute or clarinet, right? With clarinet, you get a very kind of a cooler, more pressurized kind of sound. With flute, you get like a just kind of very bright and open kind of doubling sound. Putting them together and the trumpet, then you just really start to get this kind of wind band sound right behind the it's a very, very intense sound, right? And then you got the horn coming in an octave lower, and it's doubling with English horn and so on. And I'm just kind of wondering, could the violas be doubling that as well, so that we just get this beautiful cushion of string tone right in there? And so on, and it just kind of goes on and on, and yeah, and then we get to here. So I feel that you should try to score this so that all of the all of the dynamics are exactly the same, right? And some of these, like, you sort of didn't really correct the, go to the new dynamic. I think it should all be exactly what is asked for. So it's like all piano or pianissimo in all the instruments, and just have it balanced that way. So I'm kind of interested, like, why does trumpet need to be in there, right? Is there, it's, because you have clarinet below, you've got English horn already on this pitch, right? Yeah, it's just a lot of weight, right? Like, what if we were just to give the brass a break for a minute and just have the English horn player play this, da 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 da, in octaves with the flute? That would sound really gorgeous, right? Rather than the even very, very soft trumpet absorbing some of the overtones of the flute above. This is really nice. This should be rolled, right, rather than just pluck. Yum 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 yum, da da da, yum 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 yum, roll, yum bum 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 bum. So you just try to make this subtler, right? And I think you should also say, like, don't worry about lointain. Instead, have piano like non-vibrato, right? Or just like make it just really icy as much as possible, rather than da 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 da. It should be more like da 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 da. You're just really without any kind of expression, except for just being very, very soft and kind of misty and gray in the background, or say moonlit, right? And that takes us to this final, bum ba da da dum. Could this be just a single instrument, like just English horn? Because, like, right here, we just come from the icy distance. Do we want a sense of intimacy now, right? Like, we've floated down on a pleasure boat, right? We've left the party. We were at this beautiful moment. We were on the barge with our favorite person, or on the boat with our favorite person. The air is perfumed. The night is warm, and above we have the moon has come out, and it's shining on that place where we just had that dance, and that's where we hear that, like, almost like an echo from the distance. Where they're still partying, and we can hear ya da 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 dum. Then you turn to your favorite person, ya da 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 dum. But at least we found each other, didn't we? Right? So why does it have to be so full? Can't it just be a single instrument, like one person, right? One other person beside yourself, and then bum bum ba da da dum. So right in here. Okay, so all right. Here's where we run into some more problems. Like, remember I was saying before, when we were looking at the triplet section, I was saying, like, just very, very thick. There's a lot of functions here that are getting in the way of being able to hear certain things clearly, right? And you can hear this in the mock-up, like the da-da-dum. You can barely hear the da-da-dum, da-da-dum. It just really doesn't, it doesn't come through. And one of the reasons why is because they're like these notes, these E's, in the trumpet and the flute and oboe and violin and so on, they are so present, right? And especially when things thicken up, right? They're so present that they just blot out our ability to hear da da dum, even though you've given it to a lot of different instruments, right? So it's just not coming through that clear. It should also be slurred, right? So da dum dum. So yeah, so I would just say, like, ease up, allow certain textural passages to be simpler, I would say. Yeah, there's strange things going on here. Yeah. Right. Yeah, and I can see, like, I made some adjustments to certain beams and they ended up weird. Yeah, so apologize about that. I mean, I can see how, like, sort of doing some copy pasting from the piano part and so on could lead to certain things. But, this really should be like this, right? And then, here, let me get rid of that. And just throw in a tie. Right, and of course, like, this should all be, like, first voice, right? So you can do that just by holding down, like I said before, Option or Alt 1, right? And then that sort of corrects a lot of things. Now we have, yeah, I see what's going on here. So like changing the voice from first voice to second when there was a hidden object or hidden rest or something like that, it changes the visible object into a hidden note. All right, I totally see what's going on here. Yeah. So yeah, I'm going to have to have threads, I think, from now on. Stems. I said threads before. Stems. Yeah. So we're sort of seeing that same problem here. Now watch, I'm going to change this to first voice. Yeah, and we see the disappearing note again. Yeah, but throw in the slurs on those parts. Yeah, and so I would say just like okay, before I give you a final analysis, I think we need to put bass clef back on this. Okay, so bum, bum. So we add things to it. So maybe instead of having so many voices go da-dum, how about half of the winds and maybe just one or two of the brass like you've got here, but just like a single one rather than like A3 or whatever is implied. Da-dum, and then tie. Don't play it again. Just tie those pitches, right? Those Bs, and then add other instruments over them, doubling the harp. Ping, because like when this is played on piano, the pianist like goes da-dum, and then they go ting, and they've got the pedal going for the entire thing. So the da-dum, the B just keeps holding, right? So playing it again is kind of like a tautology, right? To use a fancy word, it's sort of like an overstatement of something that's already happening, right? So just to have half the wind instruments tie their Bs and the other ones coming in on top of it, doubling these, right? It's like that is a really great job for, rather than scoring so much low flute that gets swallowed up by trumpet. Just save your flute family for doubling this, right? And like then have, like, instead of having these sort of dribs and drabs tying over, just have them come in to double what's going on below right here, right? So you don't need to have the cellos come in yet. Da-dum, and then the cellos come in here. So it's a lot clearer and more separated in terms of the functions, right? Anyway, so I hope that this is giving you a lot of different things to think about, Anthony, and I really hope you don't feel like I'm beating up on you here. It's just, like, I feel the sheer ambition and energy and purpose behind a lot of this scoring, and I admire it immensely. I don't get the feeling that I'm thinking, oh, geez, I'm having to teach Anthony everything. That's not it at all. I mean, I can see the meaning behind this and the intention and everything else. And there's a lot of, there is some craft that, you have thought about things. You've seen how things are orchestrated in other scores, and you're bringing that into here, and that sense of color and texture and everything else, right? So I'd say the first lesson, the big lesson that you can get from this is really try to be more economical, right? So like everything doesn't have to be a tutti, right? Like you can be very, very spare in your orchestration. You can say twice as much with half as many people, right? So I'd say that would be like lesson number one. Lesson number two is you just really be aware of like the strong and weak registers of the instruments, right? So for instance, like flute is just a classic. Like every you would think, well, look at all of the notes that the flute can play. They can play from like B below middle C all the way up to, there's all of this space in the staff. Why can't I just use it all the time as what's used most of the time for flute? Well, the answer to that is that the strongest register of the flute really starts above the staff and goes up to its higher notes, right? So in big complex textures, the way that you're scoring them, that really you'll have to score higher flute if you want it to be heard. And to a certain extent, that would also be true of strings. For your upper strings, even violas, like violas, violins, 1 and 2, and so on. If you have a lot going on in your brass, then that will basically just blot out everything that's going on in the strings. So the strings just naturally need to be higher in order to be heard in big, thick, massive textures, right? And then, of course, there's the harp, which is sort of the weakest instrument of all. If you're bringing the harp in to play something, then it has to, it just really has to be so lightly accompanied, especially if the harp itself is going to play something which is subtle, right? So the subtler the harp part, the more the less accompaniment it really requires from somebody else, right? It just makes, if you want to really make it about the harp, then everybody else has has got to shut up and back off, right? So yeah, so those are some of those are fundamental, right? Some people out there might be rolling their eyes and saying, "Oh, well, Thomas, I know that, right?" But the thing is that I will see scores from experienced orchestrators who are entering these challenges, or maybe asking me to look at something on Patreon or something like that, or just dropping something in the Facebook group. People who are actually fairly experienced sometimes make these errors, right? Of like, scoring the flutes too low, or, having a very ambitious harp part when there's tons of stuff going on in other parts. Scoring the strings very low and them getting blasted out of the water by the trumpets and so on. So it's it's not like it's not as if these are these are always the most basic lessons. Sometimes it's something that people instinctively know, but they just have to be reminded. So I think it's good to go over some of this, to go back to the basics, and especially like when presented with something that is as complex as what you've scored here. So I think that the complexity and the just the sweep of the imagination here is something that's so admirable, and so it just makes me feel really, really excited and hopeful for the future, and hopeful for your future, Anthony. Like, if you're putting out things like this, where you are, you just have so much drive and so much, you're hearing the bigger textures, the bigger picture, right? Like that's really, you are focusing on the forest rather than the trees, right? So, and that's like the opposite of can't see the forest for the trees. You are seeing the beautiful forest, right? And you are bringing it to life here in these, these really big, heavily textured kinds of scoring, right? So what I would say is like, ease off a little bit, get more into the individual character of the instruments and so on and so forth. And, and don't bring out the brass very often, right? It's like the timpani too, right? The more the timpani is doing things, the more people will just kind of get used to it, right? And so what, the timpani are playing again. And the same thing with like the brass too, right? The more the brass plays, just sort of like, yeah, all right. Rather than it just being really impressive and stirring and, oh, wow, now there was a trumpet solo, right? But if the trumpet is always playing the melody throughout the work, then it's like, oh, yeah, it's another trumpet solo, right? So what, right? So just really be careful, like be proportional, be very carefully proportional in the way that you score this. And as for me, I'm going to just have to rethink how I offer the templates in the future. So just remains for me to thank you so much, Anthony, for for your support on Patreon and for being a part of this. I think it takes a lot of guts, to enter one of these challenges. And and I think what you need to know is that like we are all rooting for you. I've yet to have read an uncharitable and unkind comment below one of these videos. And I really thank everybody out there, and just like props to you guys, respect. Thank you so much for saying what's constructive rather than what's destructive or egotistical about somebody's score. Like your success is my success, right? The better that you do something, the happier I will feel, right? That's really what it's all about. I've got no horse in this race except for you getting better, right? And for taking the ideas that you have and making them stronger and showing you how they work orchestrally, right? And if they don't work, why is that, right? And how you can improve it, like how you can like use that information to build to ever more powerful scoring. So yeah, and I think that you just really do have an instinct for the dramatic and the majestic and everything else, and that's it's so creditable. It's so that makes me really excited to hear, right? Even though I can pick apart a dozen things that could be fixed on a page, it doesn't mean that I'm not impressed or excited by it. I think it's really, really cool. So thanks for that. Thanks for the work that you put into this and the support and everything and the awesome comments that you've left on some other scores. That means a lot. Thanks everybody else. And now I only have left one score from the Longa level group of participants. I've just blasted through everything in a couple of days after studying and taking notes coming up to this point. So I'm just going to go do that. So everybody sit back, have a cup of tea, and then click on the next video.